Hey everyone, I'm Thomas Wooden Railway and welcome to today's video on 2022 Edward for the Thomas & Friends Wooden Railway merchandise line. If you've been a viewer on my channel over the years, you may know that Edward is one of, if not, my favorite Thomas & Friends character. Growing up, I didn't really have like an outright favorite character, but as I've gotten older, I don't know, Edward just speaks to me. Maybe it's just because I'm getting older, but I really enjoy Edward's personality. He's just a good engine overall and an even better friend. So when the 2022 Thomas Wooden Railway line was revamped and the promo pictures leaked out, I was super excited to see that we were getting basically like a brand new version of Edward that we had never seen before. We'd always kind of gotten this short version of Edward that, you know, sufficed, but Edward hadn't really changed or been upgraded in 25 years, so we didn't really know anything different. However, I'm happy to say that this 2022 version of Edward, I've really just, you know, fallen in love with over the past couple of years as I've gotten to look at it more. One of the big changes with Edward is that he is bigger. Like I said, we used to have kind of a short version of Edward, which we put up with because we didn't really know any better. But Edward is a long engine. He's a big boy, and it's really cool to see like this awesome wheel arrangement we got going on here. I'll talk about the face in a little bit, but yeah, just giving Edward, you know, some different size wheels, giving him a little bit of a bigger tender. You know, it's you know, with Thomas Wooden Railway, sometimes you forget how big or small the engines actually are because their proportions and sizes tend to fluctuate based on the needs of the merchandise versus accurately portraying them. But yeah, I'm a big fan of this version of Edward, and it was so awesome to see, like I said, a revamped version of Edward, because for the first 25 years of Thomas Wooden Railway, this was basically the version of Edward that we got. I like this Edward, but I think it's also sort of a syndrome of, you know, we never got anything better. We don't really know the difference. But Edward looked like this for a really long time. He didn't exactly have an accurate wheel arrangement. He probably should have had a wheel in the middle there. And then, you know, his front body is really the same size as a Wooden Railway Thomas, and that's obviously not the case. But again, that's one of those situations where, you know, we kind of get concessions with Wooden Railway characters. But Edward was always a very consistent character. You know, his body stayed roughly the same over the years. And this is the 2013 version of Edward from when Fisher-Price took over the range. And I remember seeing this Edward in stores, probably at Toys R Us around that time. And I was just enamored with this Edward. I thought it looked so good, specifically the face. This was one of the few characters I've seen over the years where, you know, their 2013 versions, I looked at their faces and I was like, yes, that is a great face. And honestly, that made me want to collect the new versions of the engines, and it ultimately led me to replacing, you know, I guess like the old style learning curve engines with the new style Fisher-Price engines in my Thomas Wooden Railway series. And Edward was honestly one of the best looking engines that I can remember seeing. Even after Thomas Wooden Railway was initially discontinued, we did get this wood version of Edward, and, you know, all things considered, it looks pretty similar to the old version. It definitely helps that it's painted. But, you know, the overall shape of Edward is still there. The face isn't that terrible. I'm not a super big fan of what I like to call like the twinkling in the eye, which if you can see, it's like these white dots that they started to add to the merchandise. I don't know, kind of makes them look a little bit more childish. But, I mean, if you handed this wood version of Edward to like a stranger on the street and was like, you know, hey, you know, compare it with this 2013 Edward, they're really not going to know the difference. Maybe the one thing is that, you know, it doesn't have that plastic coal on the back. But, you know, kind of getting off topic here, Edward looked this way for a really long time. So when 2022 Thomas Wooden Railway was introduced, it was a bit of a surprise to see Edward so long and honestly just so awesome. It's kind of a reminder that he's a bigger engine, and he's a proud engine, and it was just really cool to see Edward in all of his well-deserved glory. However, if there was one issue that I had with this Edward, again, it's a very small issue, I was never a huge fan of the face. And I don't think it's a bad Edward face by any means, but I also don't think, you know, for the purposes of being like a default face for Edward the Blue Engine, I don't think it's the best example either. I think if we had gotten some more 2022 Thomas Wooden Railway items over the years, for example, if we gotten some sets or expansion packs, and if there had been an opportunity to get a couple different versions of Edward, maybe I would have come around on this face. But as of the making of this video, this is the only version of Edward we've ever received. And so for this shocked expression to be the default face for Edward, I don't think it really fits him. Again, I don't think it's a bad face. It's honestly kind of a nice reminder looking at it head on here, because when you look at the promo picture, it kind of just looks like he has both eyebrows raised, but when you take a look head on, he actually has his left eyebrow, the right one, as we're looking at it. It's actually cocked up a bit more than the other side. It's kind of like he got some like very interesting information, like an engine came up to him and was like, "Hey Edward, did you know blah blah blah," like a really fun fact about, you know, railways or trucks or whatever, and he's like, "Oh really? I didn't know that." I mean, so like in certain situations I see this as being, you know, a good Edward face, but again, same thing that I talked about in the Thomas video, like as a default face, as the only version of Edward we have received in this line to date, I think we can do a little bit better with the face. So what I did is I asked my good friend, Master of the Lemons, aka Sam, and I was like, hey, you know, Edward's body is great. You know, I love the big wheels. I love the elongated length. The tender's a little bit funny. I think he should have an extra wheel in the tender there. But, you know, whatever. All things considered, beggars can't be choosers. You know, I'm just in love with 2022 Thomas Wooden Railway. It's so amazing. It's so awesome to have, you know, quality products back on the shelves. But that face, I'm just not a fan of that face. And Sam said, say no more. So what I ended up doing was I went on eBay, and I was looking for, you know, basically a replacement face, similar to, you know, what I've done with other customs in the past. And you may be wondering, well, we've had 25 years of a really good Thomas Wooden Railway Edward. Like, why didn't you just take this face right here? And that's a fair question, but maybe you can kind of see what I'm getting at already. Edward's smoke box in previous models is on the thicker side. It was sort of a design choice, but, you know, when you look at Edward's basis, and especially, you know, the picture behind him, you know, Edward he has a skinny smoke box, and that, you know, of course leads to, you know, the size of his face. So if I were to line these engines up, you know, you can kind of see 2013 Edward. If I were to chop that face off and put it on 2022 Edward, it's just going to be too big. It's going to look a little awkward, and I wasn't really in the mood to try to figure out, like, okay, maybe we can shave off, you know, like a certain circumference around it. No, not really interested in that. So ideally, if we could just get this face, but smaller, that would be perfect. I can't remember if I looked at this at the time, but looking at it now, the wood face is actually smaller than the 2013 face. Maybe I can do a little bit of a comparison here. It's a tiny bit smaller, but I think if I roll it up next to 2022 Edward, it is on the smaller side. It would fit better than the 2013 face. But I'm also thinking, you know, like actually taking measurements here, I think it's actually just a tiny bit too big. I think if I were to take that wood face off and put it on the 2022 Edward, again, we'd have a little bit of an overhang. And something I've found out as I've taken faces off of wood items over the years, the faces don't tend to be their own pieces. They tend to be molded as part of the smoke box. And that kind of creates a problem when it comes to chopping this face off. You could come in here with a knife or a saw or whatever. And, you know, the face is likely going to come off, but you're also likely going to get some extra bits of black plastic from the smoke box. For example, you can even see that line in the plastic where probably, you know, the smoke box is actually two separate pieces that they put together. So in my experience, experience, I've cut faces off of engines, wood engines, I should say, like Rosie and Harvey, and I always had an issue with them. Sort of, like, again, it's not really a clean cut. That is in contrast to these older models, basically up until Thomas Wood, where, yeah, the faces were like 100% their own piece. You come in with like a knife or something and just jam it down in there and it pops off, and it's really, really easy. So what I ended up doing in order to make this happen is I went on eBay and I started to look for a good CGI Edward face. And the good news is that there are some other brands of Thomas and Friends merchandise out there, I should say, that have utilized a CGI Edward face in the past, specifically the Thomas and Friends Take and Play range. And this is the face that I decided to use. It's from a 2014-2015 Take and Play Edward, where, you know, the smoke box is smaller, but it also has like that classic CGI look that I'm going for. And I can't really remember exactly why I settled on this particular model. I think it was just on the cheaper side. But the good news is that the face was in like perfect condition, which is what I was after. For those who don't know, around 2014-2015, there was a massive redesign with the Take and Play toys, and their proportions got squashed. This is the Thomas version, so it's not as bad, I should say, but, you know, wheels were missing. Everything was kind of shrunk down and squashed together. And probably the biggest change is that, you know, these one-way fat magnets were introduced, which was kind of sad because Take Along and Take and Play was always kind of known for, oh, it's these smart two-way magnets and they're so small. And yeah, they don't, you know, really work with Thomas Wooden Railway. You can kind of fudge it, but yeah, huge redesign, and Edward and all of the other characters in the line were really no exception. So I went after this version of Edward, I think, now that I think about it, because that style of Edward just isn't as desirable as like a 2013 Edward with a good CGI face, but, you know, the body is still proportioned correctly and the tender and everything like that. So anyway, let's get to the part that everybody wants to see. This is the new custom version of Edward that I have here. Again, this was made by Master of the Lemons, and I have said that I do love 2022 Edward, but the face kind of always struck me as just a little bit odd. Like, I was like, yeah, it's fine, I guess, for specific circumstances. Again, like, you know, as a default face, I don't think it's great. It kind of makes Edward look like he's wandering around the railway in total, like, bewilderment. Like, whoa, the sheds. Whoa, you have a coal station. Whoa, it's Knapford, you know, and like, I'm exaggerating here, but it kind of gives off that impression of like, why is Edward so surprised all the time? And this is why I kind of went looking for some better default faces, and this is the one that I landed on. And I like 2022 Edward, this Edward. I like this Edward a lot. I think it's really, really great. No complaints for the most part. But I have to say that I absolutely love this version of Edward right here. I think maybe one of the most glaring things about this face, maybe you can see, is that it has a bit of a shine to it, and that's because it came from a different merchandise range, which isn't too surprising, but, you know, you can definitely see it under the studio light. There's just a different type of plastic used in this face right here versus the plastic that was used for the metal trains Take and Play at the time. So I notice it too, you know, where I have it, you know, where I have this Edward displayed in my collection. Like, I'll walk by and the light will catch it, and it kind of throws you off for a sec. But once you kind of get over the fact that his face is a little shiny, I mean, it's not terrible at all. It just maybe makes Edward look a little sweaty, or maybe he has an awesome skincare routine and his skin is, you know, flourishing or something like that. I don't really know. But to me, this really puts a great Edward model over the top to being pretty much perfect, in my opinion. I mean, this is just a great face, and the fact that the face is smaller to fit the, you know, smaller smoke box, it's just amazing. So I'm a huge fan of this custom. Before I end this video, I think I'll talk briefly about maybe some other thoughts I have about Edward here. I am a fan of the different wheel sizes. I love that we get, like, I guess I would call it a proper size Edward for once. But the tender wheels have always kind of befuddled me. I think if they had made Edward's tender just like a tiny bit longer, you could maybe squeeze, like, you know, an extra set of wheels in there. But honestly, I'm thinking this was done on purpose. I think they want to do some tricky things with the proportions and the designs, you know, to remind you that, like, hey, Edward's a big engine, but he's not as big as, like, Gordon or Hero, for example, or even Emily. Like, those engines are going to have 6 wheels on their tenders. Edward, you know, Edward and James, not quite there. Personally, I think it looks a little bit awkward. It's like enough of an open space where you're like, should something go there? Like, it makes you wonder, but at the same time, it's not like a deal breaker. I've also found Edward's tender, the shape of it, to be a little interesting. I guess this part at the end here, kind of, you know, below this swoop here, that's supposed to be the door. You can kind of see the steps there. I'm guessing that's what that's supposed to represent, but then it doesn't make Edward's tender symmetrical. Like, the left side here is definitely longer than the right side. So when you line it up, you know, you have to kind of imagine that this gap is not supposed to be there. It's almost like this tender is supposed to be like right up against Edward, like that, basically. But to me, I always want to put this tender backwards like this. It feels more natural to try to make it as flush with the cab as possible. And that's not how it's supposed to go. It's supposed to go this way. You can even see it on the picture in the back there. So that's taken some time to get used to. But like with all of these 2022 engines, I mean, you can just stare for hours at all the detailing. You know, the beautiful red lines. We do have some side rod action right there. And then even up close, you know, there's, you can see light coming from the cab. I mean, that's supposed to be like, you know, from his fire burning. And yeah, I mean, these toys have been out for a couple of years now, and I really don't get tired of looking at them. I think maybe one of the issues people have with them is maybe they're not a fan of the wheels, which I think is kind of a toss-up. I kind of go back and forth on them. But, you know, I think for the longest time, we had this version of Edward here, which wasn't bad, you know? But I also, like I said at the beginning of the video, we didn't really know any better. So, like, yeah, this Edward, it worked, it sufficed. I mean, like, yeah, no complaints. It's a classic shape, we're all used to it. But then once you realize, like, what Edward could look like, it feels like he's almost reaching his full potential here. And honestly, that's really, really cool. So, yeah, to say the least, I am a big fan of this Edward, and I can't thank Master of the Lemons, aka Sam, enough for doing this for me. I think when I made the previous Thomas video, I actually hadn't seen Sam do some custom work. I had seen him do custom work in person, but not something related to one of my projects. And so over the summer when we got together, I had him do some very impromptu custom work for me, again, swapping out faces. And man, you know, when I do custom stuff, the very limited custom work that I do, I'm always like super careful and don't want to scratch everything and make everything nice, because I'm like, man, if the knife slips or something, like, it could ruin everything. And man, Sam just digs in there with his X-Acto knife and just goes to town, and it's really amazing and incredible to watch. He's done this dozens and dozens, if not hundreds of times, and he's so comfortable around taking all of this out, really. So yeah, it was really cool to watch him work. And I should say, if you're wondering how the face is adhered to Edward, I believe it's just super glue, honestly. I could come in and change the face. I don't really feel the need to. And I think another face that could work, if anybody wants to try to do this custom, is an Adventures face. Is probably roughly the same size. It's definitely the same design. I know that a push-along Edward face from like 2019, that is not going to work, because that Edward, for lack of a better term, he's pretty chunky. So there are some options out there, but it's not like you have unlimited resources either. You do kind of have to pick and choose. But I've been rambling for far too long. It really is a joy to see one of my favorite, if not my favorite, Thomas and Friends character in all of his glory. And like I said, I was always a fan of that, you know, 2013 style of Edward. but it's kind of like, again, you don't really realize what your full potential can be unless someone shows it to you. And Fisher-Price and Mattel did do a really good job of giving us a great Edward body to work with. And I think I just improved upon it a little bit by adding what I think is just a better default face. So that's going to do it for this video. Again, big thanks to Master of the Lemons, aka Sam, for making this custom happen. And I'm really excited that I finally got to show it off to the rest of you. So check out the Thomas video if you haven't already, and then in the coming months I'm going to have the rest of the Steam team and their upgraded designs featured as well. So that's going to do it for today, friends. Thank you so much for watching. I appreciate your support, and I'll see you on the next video.